elites in the academy, elites in politics.
Very kind, and thank you so much for the invitation. We're both really excited to be here with you all. Grateful to see you all thinking through these issues with us, as it's something obviously we care deeply about, and what it means for both Christianity in the United States and democracy in the United States, and our civil society here. So again, thank you so much, and we're really pleased to be here. And so if it is all right with you all, I'll share my screen, because a lot of our work, we're really able to bring it alive visually with some of the data. And so I'll do that now, and I and Sam will give a bit of an introduction into our research, what our book is about, but hopefully too you're able to find that for more in-depth study of Christian nationalism here in the US. So let me see if I got that. Does that look good?
Yep, we're good.
All right, thank you, Sam. So yeah, again, Sam and I have been working in this area for about 6 or 7 years now, and it culminated really in our book that was released last March in 2020, right before the pandemic hit America and the world, actually. But today we'll share a little bit about what Christian nationalism is, defining that, and looking at how it interacts and has so much important effects in politics, in the pandemic, and too with how our society is wrestling with racial issues and racial injustice in the US. And so, as was talked about before, let's see here, January 6th was a very pivotal moment. And I think will be looked back on, and most of us could probably agree, as an integral moment in US history, where we saw insurrectionists attack the Capitol. And I've seen it described even recently as, this was something that in the Civil War, in the Revolutionary War, or after any of the wars that were fought here, people weren't able to do is actually break into the Capitol. But we saw it on January 6th. And we saw so many symbols of Christianity, crosses, groups kneeling in prayer before they entered the Capitol violently. Jesus 2020 or Jesus Save signs, or once they entered the Senate floor, stopping in prayer to Jesus and to God. And so all of this symbolism wrapped up into what was taking place there and what brought people there. And so, Sam and I wouldn't say that Christian nationalism is the only explanation of what happened on January 6th, but we would say that it is a key and vital explanation that needs to really be wrestled with by people of faith and those outside the Christian faith too, to see what different threads are a part of this, and in our democratic system, our body politic, to wrestle with these things. Because while we were watching the Capitol insurrection, while shocking for some of us that have been studying this, it wasn't surprising. Much of this was on the way and was being built, and this was a natural outcome in many ways. So the research that we're going to share today, and some of it has happened even since the book came out, is from our book, Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States. And there have been people writing about American identity and religious nationalism for a while, but what we're able to do in this book that really hadn't been done before is apply and understand this culturally and also empirically. So how widespread is it? And so we actually were able to come up with a measure of Christian nationalism, and in this way try to understand and make sense of exactly what it is, how many people embrace it, how strongly, and then try to think too of what does it mean in these different spheres and these different hot button issues in the United States, as we try to think through the issues that we're facing. And so we define Christian nationalism as a cultural framework that idealizes and advocates for a fusion of Christianity, and we put an asterisk there on purpose. It's a particular type of Christianity that we'll unpack here today, with American civic life. And what Americans desire, who embrace Christian nationalism, they desire to see this type of Christianity privileged in the public sphere, that it will have an effect on our national identity, our public policies, the sacred symbols that we have and that we rally around. They want to see it truly integrated, what it means to be an American. And so to measure this, we'll turn to, but this idea of this type of Christianity, the reason we place an asterisk by it is that to a certain population, it means people like us. And those quotes are key because the us is an in-group that they're creating and trying to create, this identity of who we are and who we truly are. And seeing that group as the center of the culture, the unquestioned center of what it means to be an American or who has access to privilege and power. And many times it means white, natural born citizens that are culturally Christian, politically conservative. So what we find is that it isn't just Christianity as we might think of it as, a number of beliefs or creeds from the historic Christian faith, but that it's a cultural package. There are other aspects of this culture that get packaged onto this idea of Christianity. That's what Christian nationalism is. It's placing people and drawing people into this cultural framework of what it means to be a true American and what America really truly should be. And so our work, we try to disentangle in some ways what are the different parts of that cultural package, and we find, and we'll share today, and truly why we're glad to see different people of faith wrestling with this like you all, is that some of those aspects of the cultural package, we would say, don't align with many of the historic Christian beliefs or behaviors or creeds that they might have had for centuries. So when we measure Christian nationalism, we ask 6 different questions of respondents, and we do this in national surveys of people all across the United States. And we ask them questions like, do they believe that the United States and its future is part of God's plan for the world? Or do they think the federal government should advocate Christian values? Should the government declare the United States a Christian nation? And to the extent that they could agree or strongly disagree, we're able to assign point values and then add those different questions together to create a scale. So you can see the scale in front of you, ranging from 0 to 24. And a 0 means that they strongly disagreed with all 6 of those questions. A 24 means that they strongly agreed with all 6 of those questions. But you can see that many Americans, are in the middle somewhere. And so to think about Christian nationalism isn't to see it as an either or, a binary, either you are a Christian nationalist or you are not, but that people exist and Americans exist on a scale. So some embrace it more strongly, others, resist or reject it in some ways, but we can see that Americans fall all across the scale. And that's an important point. As we wrestle with this, or as you lead your congregations or your denomination, you're going to have people that exist all across this scale, and that has implications, as you can see. And so to make it easier to talk about this rather than higher or lower on the scale, we assign some different names for these 4 different groups, what we call 4 different orientations to Christian nationalism. And so you can see on the very left-hand side of the scale there, rejectors are those that say that Christianity and this national identity should have nothing to do with each other. That being a Christian is not a part of what it means to be American. So they reject very strongly this idea that there should be a close relationship. Resistors fall between the mean, which would be right in the middle of the scale there, and then down to 6 on that scale. And they aren't as wholeheartedly rejecting this idea of Christianity having a place in the public sphere, but they resist it. It isn't something that they're comfortable with, but they don't wholeheartedly oppose it. Accommodators are kind of the mirror image of resistors, and they fall from the mean, the middle of the scale, up to 17 there. And accommodators, we would say that they are definitely supportive of this idea of Christianity being a part of American identity, national identity, but that their support and embrace of it isn't wholehearted. They still might fudge a little bit, or they might have some questions about it. But again, for the most part, they're comfortable with this idea of Christianity being privileged in the public sphere and a part of our national identity. And then we have ambassadors, those that are at the upper quarter of the scale. And these are the Americans that would say, yes, Christianity should have a privileged position in American civil society. To be American means to be Christian, and to be Christian means you're American, and it's a part of how we should see ourselves, that this country is great because it is Christian. We need to get that back. And where you fall in these four groups truly matters. Now, when we create these four groups, we can see that the sizes vary. So rejectors are about 21.5% of the population. Resistors, a little over a quarter of the population. You can see accommodators are about a third of the population. This is our largest group. Those that, again, are comfortable with Christianity being a key part of our civil society. And then ambassadors are actually the smallest group, about 20% of the population. But again, they strongly embrace this idea of a Christian nation. And so when you add ambassadors and accommodators together, you can see that over half the population in the US is comfortable to some extent with this idea of Christianity and American civil and civic identity being closely intertwined, that being a part of who we are as a nation overall. And again, this is using nationally representative data gathered from Americans all across the US. Now, we have a number of different arguments, things that we talk about in the book. And the first, what we'll look at is looking essentially at politics in this sphere. And so we see with the election in 2016 of Donald Trump, and even in 2020 for those that voted for him, even though he ended up losing that election, you'll see over and over the common explanation is that it was white Christians, or especially white evangelicals, that their support was key to why Donald Trump won. But what we think and what we're able to show empirically is that it isn't just being a white Christian or white evangelical, or even a white Seventh-day Adventist, depending on the level of support for Donald Trump within your denomination, but that it is Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism specifically that explains support for Donald Trump. And so let me unpack what that means. So when we look at who voted for Trump in 2016 and in 2020, we can see that where Americans fall on this scale of Christian nationalism, which orientation they are a part of, we can see that it had a very strong relationship with whether or not they voted for Donald Trump. And so you can see that if you are a rejector in 2016, right, with that 2017 Baylor Religion Survey there on the very left, there very few voted for Donald Trump. But accommodators, over half voted for Donald Trump, and then ambassadors, 3/4 voted for Donald Trump. And so you can see a very linear pattern here. The more that you embrace this idea of a Christian nation, the more likely you were to vote for Donald Trump. And the same happened in 2020. Using data gathered right after the election, we see that that relationship is essentially unchanged. Those Americans who embraced this idea of we are a Christian nation, they were much more likely to vote for Donald Trump. And so in our book, we're able to go in more depth here as to why that is. In looking at Trump and his surrogates and the rhetoric that they use, the idea that we're going to defend Christianity, we're going to make this country great again by returning it to its Christian heritage, defending the faith, people saying Merry Christmas again. We're able to show all these different examples, and you can see that that had an effect. They were speaking to a particular group of Americans, and it resonated with these Americans. So we can see that here, Christian nationalism mattered. Now, once we actually look, though, at white born-again Protestants or conservative evangelical Protestants who voted for Trump in 2020, we're able to see that, again, a little over 80% voted for Trump. And so this aligns with what you might have seen in a number of national media articles about this, that white born-again Protestants, 82% voted for Trump. They were the reason why he was in the White House. But what we're able to show is that it isn't just white born-again Protestants, but it's those white born-again Protestants that, again, embrace Christian nationalism. It has to do with this cultural framework that, again, is very prevalent within white Protestantism. But that cultural framework is what is doing the heavy lifting in voting for Trump. And so you can see that here. So among this group, white born-again Protestants, if they were rejectors, people that reject Christian nationalism, very few voted for Donald Trump. And even if they resisted, about a third voted for Trump. So you can see that among this group of white born-again Protestants, if you reject or resist Christian nationalism, you are much less likely to vote for Trump. But if you were an accommodator or an ambassador, you're almost guaranteed to support or vote for Donald Trump. And so, again, within white evangelicalism and white born again Protestants, it is Christian nationalism that is really explaining why they were voting the way that they were. And finally, we look again at the 2020 election across not just white born again Protestants, but white liberal Protestantism or white Catholicism. And you can see a number of really fascinating relationships. And so I'll try to pull these out here because I know there are a lot of bars here. So if we look at those white bars first, those are our white born again Protestants. And so you can see on the previous slide, it's the same relationship. As they embrace Christian nationalism, as their accommodators or those that are ambassadors, much more likely to vote for Donald Trump. But what do you
Can you
see?
hear me?
But what do you see, sorry, with
Hello?
white liberal Protestants, the dark blue bar, or the gray bar with white Catholics? You can see the exact same relationship, right? So as you move across this scale, you can see that for white liberal Protestants and white Catholics, the same relationship holds true. They are much more likely to vote for Donald Trump. And really, if you look at accommodators or ambassadors, they look almost identical to white born again Protestants. So what this tells us is that Christian nationalism works essentially the same way across religious traditions. If you're a white Catholic or a white liberal Protestant or a white born again Protestant, and you are an ambassador, you all look, right? Those people look very similar in how they see the world. And they actually look much different from co-religionists, other Catholics or other liberal Protestants, or even white born again Protestants that reject Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism cuts across our religious traditions in the United States, that this cultural framework is embraced across different traditions and is very consequential, even among non-Christian religions or even among secular Americans. We can see that it has an effect. And so they look very similar to each other. So again, it's this idea of Christian nationalism that is key to understanding some of what we're seeing in politics today. If we want to understand midterm elections, if we want to understand national elections and how people vote, we have to wrestle with the effects and the influence of Christian nationalism as a whole. And at this point, I will turn it over to Sam, and Sam, just let me know when to advance slides, and I'll do so.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So one of the ways we want to extend our analysis from the book, and though we are excited about everything we were able to share in the book, and we feel like it lays a necessary foundation for understanding this cultural framework of Christian nationalism. In the last 2 years, we've been able to collect subsequent data on some of the most pressing issues that our nation has faced in the last few months or the last year, really, since coronavirus. And so one of those two issues is COVID-19 and obviously the experience of racial injustice, especially African Americans at the hands of police and discrimination and inequality. And so we've actually been able to zero in on how Christian nationalism and specifically white Christian nationalism helps us understand why America has become so polarized on issues of coronavirus and also issues of racial injustice. So let me give you a first example of what we're talking about here in the slides. So in May of 2020, we started to collect more data, and we asked that lockdowns were starting to be implemented, and we were all told to do things like wear masks and to avoid touching our faces and to use hand sanitizer and to avoid going out to certain areas where there were going to be lots of people. And so we were curious whether or not Christian nationalism corresponded to whether or not people would follow those precautions and do the things that they were supposed to do. And so, Andrew, if you could show the next slide there. So this is an example of what we found. This is the percentage of white Americans who said they never took these precautions within the last 2 weeks. And we asked at the beginning of May, end of April. And so this is right when coronavirus is not at its height necessarily numerically, but and certainly it was climbing in the United States. We were just implementing lockdowns, and there was definitely a lot of fear about, okay, how do we respond to this disease? Well, we see that there was actually a pretty linear association in a lot of regards with as somebody moves up our Christian nationalism scale, if they're white American, as they move up our Christian nationalism scale, they were more likely to say that they never wore a mask or touching their face. We actually, if we could extend other things, we saw this in other factors as well. Like they were unlikely to wash their hands more often than they were supposed to, or to avoid going out in public. And so we saw that white Americans, the more they affirmed Christian nationalism, the more likely they were to resist precautions that were recommended from the media, from scientists, from medical experts, and to in fact do the opposite. They were more likely to do the things that they were told not to do. So looking at the next slide, we see that the more white Americans moved up our Christian nationalism scale, the more likely they were to do things like go shopping for non-essentials, go to places of worship. And we don't see it's a high percentage, but we don't, in terms of like even ambassadors, not many ambassadors in early May, late April were going to attending places of worship because most had been shut down. But you do see a linear association between rejectors and ambassadors in most likely to attend a place of worship, also visiting family and friends in person. All the things that people were instructed, or not, if not commanded, highly encouraged by media, scientists, medical professionals to say, let's avoid doing these things so that we can stem the spread of the virus. Christian nationalism seemed to be powerfully associated with avoiding doing the things that you were recommended to do and doing the things that people said, hey, you probably want to avoid these things so that we can stem the spread of the virus. Now, why was that going on? Well, there are a couple of explanations that we have for this. One, we have shown in other studies that Christian nationalism, specifically among white Americans, and I will in a little bit, I will disentangle the difference that why we're emphasizing white Christian nationalism now as opposed to just Christian nationalism in general, because I do think there is a distinction that I'll show there. But among white Americans, as Christian nationalism increases, it seems to be associated with a resistance to expertise. And in all forms, white Christian nationalism really is indicative of what social scientists and political scientists and sociologists call populism. Populism is characterized by a resistance to and a skepticism of elites in any context, media elites, elites in the academy, elites in politics, and in favor of grassroots, in some ways conspiratorial kinds of thinking that says, hey, the common people really know the truth and those experts are really just trying to pull one over on us. And so white Christian nationalism in some senses is very much so entangled with this idea of skepticism towards expertise. And so if the media is saying, hey, wear a mask, don't go out in public, they must be up to something. They must be up to no good. And this actually corresponds to patterns that we saw in surveys as well. So if Andrew would go to the next slide, we see we asked Americans, who do you trust during coronavirus? And we asked them a variety of different leaders and groups we presented to them. And here I'm just going to compare ambassadors and rejectors. So people at the polar end of the spectrum. What I've done is I have organized these ambassadors from left to right in terms of who they trusted the most for information during coronavirus. Okay, so look at that blue bar. We see the three groups that white ambassadors trusted most for information about coronavirus are Donald Trump, religious organizations, and Republicans. And then it goes down from there. Now we see at the very right tail of that on the blue bars is Congress and Democrats. And you might think that makes sense, but right in the middle, you see things like CDC and scientists and local health department and experts. Who are the people that rejectors trust the most? Well, it's not a mirror image. Like rejectors are not a mirror opposite of ambassadors in this regard, because it's not like rejectors all trust the Democrats, right? Like we don't see that kind of pattern. In fact, we see rejectors of Christian nationalism were more likely to trust scientists, followed by medical experts, followed by the CDC and the local health department. And see there seems to be, among rejectors, there seems to be a willingness to trust regarding coronavirus expertise, medical expertise, scientific expertise. Okay, who am I going to listen to? But among ambassadors, white ambassadors in particular, there is this temptation to activate that tribal or partisan switch to say, I'm only going to trust a small select group of people. And for white Christian nationalists, that was Trump, religious organizations, Republicans, and not the experts. And so why was this so dangerous? Obviously, the potential for explosive coronavirus spread. Now, we also see some other patterns that tell us something else about white Christian nationalism that we did not know going into the book. We saw hints of this when we wrote our book, but we really didn't have the questions at the time to tap into, say, how Christian nationalism affected people's view about the economy or about personal liberty or libertarian freedom. And so I think we have become more clear about how white Christian nationalism is not only associated with this brand of populism that questions expertise and authority and really looks to small partisan tribal leaders for information, but it is also something that devalues the vulnerable in our society in favor of things like personal liberty and economic prosperity. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. So we asked a series of questions about lockdown restrictions during coronavirus. So the governments, state and local governments, were instituting lockdown restrictions, saying we've got to maintain social distancing to protect our vulnerable populations. And so how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to limit the spread of the virus by doing this. So we asked a series of questions about how Americans felt about, say, protecting the economy rather than worrying about getting people sick, or protecting individual freedom, or how we needed to prioritize protecting the vulnerable. Well, you see at the bottom there, what I've done is I've shown this is from 0 to 24 across our Christian nationalism scale. And you can see the dots indicate the different questions that we asked. And we see that as Christian nationalism increases, we saw people were more likely to indicate that they wanted, and this is highly linear. I mean, look at those trends that we see. They are increasingly more likely to say, no, we need to protect the economy, or we need to protect my own personal liberty, my rights to go out and get sick if I want to, or to work if I want to, and that won't be encroached upon by any kind of government lockdown. Whereas as Christian nationalism increases, you are less likely to say, you know what, we need to make sure that we protect the elderly. We need to make sure that we protect vulnerable populations from the spread of the virus. And this is really one of these fascinating stories about, like, it really isn't, at that point, it's not necessarily about a prejudice or an us versus them. It is Christian nationalism also feeds into this ideology. It's associated with this ideology of personal freedom for us, for people like me, and for my own prosperity and my own success, even if it costs the vulnerable, in this case, their lives. But this is not only about populism and misinformation. It's not just about libertarian freedom and the economy, or beliefs about economic prosperity, but white Christian nationalism, and this is why I will unpack why we call it white Christian nationalism, is that it seems to operate differently. And this is something that we have been able to dive deeper into since the book, is that Christian nationalism seems to operate differently for white Americans than it does for non-white Americans. So let me put it this way before we go on to the next slide, Andrew. You don't have to go to the next one. So we often find, and people have pointed this out to us in the book, and we have since wanted to clarify for people, that people of color, and especially African Americans, often score as high, if not higher, on our indicators of Christian nationalism as do white Americans. So does that contradict our argument that Christian nationalism may have racist or xenophobic, or at the very least ethnocentric impulses buried within it? Well, no, not when we understand that when people hear certain kind of religious words, it means different things for different people. And so when white Americans hear things about Christian nation or Christian values or Christian heritage, they can't help but read things like our heritage, our values, our culture. And so they read it a certain way as defending what is ours culturally, and in a way that, say, African Americans don't historically resonate with. And let me show you. I'll just give you coronavirus issues as an example of that first. So this is as we asked Americans about whether it was racist to call the coronavirus the China virus. This is something that we saw Donald Trump do in over 20 tweets in March. He called coronavirus the Chinese virus or the China virus, and tweeted that out multiple times. Well, we found that as white Americans move up Andrew, you can go to the next slide. As white Americans move up our Christian nationalism scale, they're more likely to say, no, it's not racist to call it the Chinese virus or to call it the China virus. So look at the white Americans or the blue dots there, and they just shoot up, right? Like as Christian nationalism increases, they're more likely to say, no, it's not racist at all. But look for Black Americans. It's just a slight increase, but not a lot there after we've controlled for all of these other things. In other words, Christian nationalism doesn't seem to make Black Americans more insensitive to the racist language of say the Chinese virus or the China virus. It doesn't work the same way for Black Americans as it does for white Americans. Another example that we have, we asked Americans whether or not the higher infection rate among prison population should be our least concern. This is kind of an example of protecting the vulnerable. What we saw is as Christian nationalism increased for white Americans, Andrew, could you go back to the next one? Yeah. As Christian nationalism increased for white Americans, we saw that they increased in their view that prisoner infection rate shouldn't be our concern. They're getting what they deserve. But for Black Americans, it stays flat, right? So whether they score low or high on Christian nationalism, it doesn't affect their attitudes about COVID towards the vulnerable. The third one I wanted to show. We asked Americans whether or not the higher minority infection rate, African Americans and other populations of color, especially in lower income areas of the country, were being infected with coronavirus at higher rates. And we asked them, hey, is this an indication that our society really is unjust and unfair, and people are being exposed to this at an inordinate rate? We saw that as Christian nationalism increases, white Americans were more likely to say, no, it is not a symptom of injustice in our society. They're getting what they deserve. But for Black Americans, we see just a very, very slight increase. In other words, it just doesn't work the same way. Now, that was regarding coronavirus, but we've actually had other things going on in our country that tap racially salient issues that we want to share. So for example, let me show you using our 4 categories. We asked the question about whether people believe, what percent of white and Blacks believe that Black Americans face a lot of discrimination in the United States. For Black Americans, whether they're rejectors or resistors or accommodators or ambassadors, it basically doesn't change what they feel about whether or not African Americans or Black Americans face a lot of discrimination. It starts high and it stays high. But for white Americans, look what's going on. Among white rejectors, it starts off high. About 2/3 of white rejectors say that Black Americans face a lot of discrimination. But what happens is it moves up the Christian nationalism scale. Among white ambassadors of Christian nationalism, only about 10% feel that Black Americans face a lot of discrimination. So the more white Americans affirm Christian nationalism, the less likely they are to recognize anti-Black discrimination in the United States. I'll give you another example, one that is more salient to the issues that we are facing now following the Derek Chauvin verdict that we saw for the murder of George Floyd. This is the percentage of white and Blacks who agree that reports of police brutality against Black Americans are exaggerated by the media. Among Black Americans, it starts off low and it stays low, whether or not they agree or disagree with Christian nationalism. But look at what happens for white Americans. As they increase in Christian nationalism, look at that take off, right? Like it is a powerful difference. So for white Americans, our measures of Christian nationalism seem to be tapping some kind of like an ethno-traditionalism that says this country is ours and it should always be. And they perceive those kinds of claims about racial inequality as threats to this society that they believe is at its core just and righteous and good. And so that is our second argument, is that Christian nationalism, especially white Christian nationalism, helps us understand the polarization that we witnessed in 2020 regarding coronavirus, but also discrimination and anti-Black discrimination against African Americans. Our third argument, and this is one that we really feel like is important for us to hit within religious communities, people who care about faith. And this is why we're so glad to be able to talk to this conference today, people who center faith in their lives and want to know what this means for them personally. Being a Christian nationalist does not mean being a committed Christian. We actually get that question a lot. It's one of our most common questions that, hey, are you just saying that like I can't vote my values, or that because I am a committed Christian and I would like to see my values reflected in American politics, that makes me a Christian nationalist? Or is Christian nationalism just a smear word for committed or conservative Christians that we just throw around in a way to slander people? Actually, it's not. So we actually find that Christian nationalism, our measures of Christian nationalism, often work in the exact opposite direction as traditional measures of religious commitment. So I'll just give you some examples there. So when we looked at this idea of taking precautionary behaviors during coronavirus lockdown, whether or not somebody wore a mask or washed their hands more often than than they did usually, or used hand sanitizer, we find that as Christian nationalism increases, they were less likely to do those kinds of things. But what happens with religious commitment? Religious commitment, we measure with church attendance, prayer frequency, whether or not you say religious faith is important to you. And as religious commitment goes up, your likelihood of taking precautionary behaviors goes up. They go in the exact opposite directions. In other words, once we account for Christian nationalism in our statistical models, being more religious meant you were more likely to be a good neighbor during coronavirus. You were more likely to do the things that you were supposed to do to protect others from getting sick. What about racial inequality or racism? We see a similar pattern. This is the percentage, the predicted agreement of Americans who would say, I would confront a friend who told a joke about racial minorities in my presence. And so would you confront a friend who told a racist joke? As Christian nationalism increases, white Americans decline in their likelihood of confronting a friend. In other words, like white Americans who affirm Christian nationalism would be less likely to confront a friend who told a racist joke. But what happens as religious commitment increases? The exact opposite. People who are more religious were more likely to confront a friend once we account for Christian nationalism. And so this suggests to us that Christian nationalism isn't about being a committed Christian per se, right? It doesn't, and those two are not the same. Once we hold Christian nationalism in conference, as a constant, right? Once we hold it consistent, we will find that people who are more committed to their faith actually end up being the kind of neighbors that you want. And that is the kind of world that we'd like to see, where committed Christians live out their values in a positive way, where they are good citizens, good patriots, good neighbors, and salt and light to their earth. And so those are the things that we would like to see. Now, let me wrap this up with just some concluding thoughts. What are the implications for religion and politics in the United States? The first is we need a new language to talk about Christianity and Trumpism. A language that clarifies that for many, Christian is a political dog whistle. What we mean by that is that it recognizes that we are throwing around terms that mean different things to different populations. And in certain populations, the word Christian is code language, and it means culturally conservative, traditionalist values, white, natural born Protestants, or something like that. And so we want to clarify our terms. We actually have tried to stress, and we've gotten opportunities to speak to polling agencies. We spoke to Pew last year, and we actually have learned recently that Pew Research Center is going to be implementing some measures of Christian nationalism, because we tried to tell them, like, look, all of this conversation about conservative Christians, about white evangelicals, really doesn't tell us enough about the underlying ideologies that might lead certain populations to say vote for Trump, or to be very much so opposed to gun control, or pro-military, or pro-violence, or pro-capital insurrection, or all of those kinds of things. And so we want to talk about Christian nationalism, not these broad religious categories. The last thing I want to say, and this is our last point, we need to understand that many white Christian supporters of Trumpism are primarily motivated by fear of powerlessness, of cultural degradation, of social chaos. They are motivated by fear, and that really is at the root of a lot of the populist reaction that we've seen, that we saw on January 6th at the Capitol, and that we have seen in conversations about cancel culture, and that we've seen in conversations about reparations, or we've seen in conversations about policing and reform there. This is fear. And it's fear about losing something that they feel like has been taken, or is being taken by hostile parties. And so in order to start those conversations, we need to know that much of the Trumpism, especially among Christians, is rooted in that cultural fear. We're so grateful for your time. Thank you so much for your interest in us and our research, and we look forward to answering any questions we can later on.